A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Hey, Herman and Corn, I've been really enjoying the recent episodes. I am kind of in that weird state of waking up at 3 in the afternoon, which is not usually the state I'm at this part of the day, but it was a very, very disrupted day here in Jerusalem. We had the first siren from Iran. I think it was like 7, I'm going to say, and coming on the back of previous days where they were going off at like 1 in the morning and 6. But we had, I think, 4 or 5 successive waves. So we came back with little Ezra. We went to the public shelter, got back, another alert goes off, go back, try to get there within 3 minutes. And just went on and on. So you know when you kind of have that, you try to get like more than 4 hours of sleep and you get 30 minutes and then you get woken up. So I'm kind of in that haze at the moment. But I was reading on Google News an article today, and it says, I'm going to quote, "How safe are our safe rooms?" Now this is actually kind of almost a carbon copy of an article that came out last year during the missile war with Iran. This one is in today's coverage from Arik Muravsky, and he is quoting the former chief engineer of the Homefront Command, Lieutenant Colonel Reservist Benny Brosh, former chief engineer of the Homefront Command, better known to us in Israel as Pikuda Oref, and a member of the Engineers Union. So he says, in general, safe rooms have stood the test well, at a level where, if you had asked me before, I would have estimated that the situation would have been a little worse. Now, here's what the article points out, which is a bit unnerving. It says basically that last year in Petah Tikva, which has experienced a lot of attacks this year and last, some people were killed in the safe room, in the mamad, the merchav mugan dirati, the safe room that people have in their homes. And this year, apparently, some people were actually saved thanks to the mamad. They've been saving people, but not in cases, it seems, of direct impact. Now, what he says is basically, and I'm going to just paraphrase because the language is a little bit awkward, as it sometimes is when it gets translated from Hebrew. Here's what the original says. Experts explain that in order to respond to a direct hit from a half-ton missile, I'm going to replace the word to respond to with to survive. To survive a direct hit from a half-ton missile and save the inhabitants, save those sheltering. I'm not sure my translation is much better. A wall thickness of 3 meters of concrete is required. This does not exist in public shelters either. And if such a missile hits a public shelter, it will cause similar damage. So what he's saying basically is this: the mamads, the shelters in our homes and the public shelters that are scattered all over the country in different neighborhoods, those things are built to withstand shrapnel and to withstand other threats like lightweight rockets maybe, or and they also have a role to play in the event of infiltrations and UAVs, but not those gigantic Iranian missiles. And I think if you look at them, for those curious, I have a website that I set up last week called promisedenied.com, or 2 weeks ago. And it's an experiment in trying to structure the data of the Iranian attacks. And also it includes some visualizations on the scale of the missiles, because they are crazy. I have one where I plot a 3-story building against the different Iranian missiles, and some of these things are like twice as tall, traveling at up to Mach 15. Like, these are gigantic. They've got a explosive warhead on them. So we're talking about a gigantic force. Now, he says 3 meters is required. I'm looking at the apartment as I record this in my living room. And if 3 meters is required around the mamad on all directions, then we're talking about taking up an additional 6 meters in both directions and 3 meters above and below. If I'm understanding the general principles right, that it would have to be, around the space, or even if it wasn't above, because we know that the mamads, the protective spaces, are stacked in buildings, which is what gives them a lot of their structural integrity. There's a sort of synergistic effect that they have. But even if we're just talking about encapsulating all the mamads in a vertical pipe, and a vertical, pipe, I guess, is a word in a building, that's a lot of concrete and space. And in Israel, in the very dense environment we have here, that may not be practicable. And I can imagine that retrofitting, it's difficult enough to retrofit an apartment. Like many of the apartments, like the one I live in, we're one of the 30% of Israelis who don't have a safe room in our apartment. Even putting a mamad up to today's spec is challenging, never mind if we were to add that 3 meter thing to the code. So, but the conclusion is kind of, he basically says, look, we did a risk calculus and we determined that we're going to have to take this risk. Because if you look at how many missiles are getting through in this war with Iran, sadly, we're seeing in recent days an increase, it seems, and they're using cluster munitions, submunitions. And, you've got different threats. You can be in the worst case scenario hit. As we've seen, there was direct strikes on Dimona, Arad, and other places. But the chances of you being the person in the building that actually does get a direct strike, the people who get an indirect strike and a submunition might survive. So it's really a small amount of the population. But what it's basically saying is that the shelters we have are not going to do anything against a direct strike from a ballistic missile. And that's it. That's the risk calculation that we did, and we've accepted it. Now I want to ask you, Herman and Corning, I'm going to play devil's advocate and also genuinely argue the other side of this equation, coming at it from a much less informed perspective than this person, and without understanding, I guess, the budgetary dynamics at play here. But I've sort of contended that, or been critical of the fact that the public shelters in Israel are generally dilapidated. To put it mildly, they don't have, a lot of them don't have, water, internet. And I know that internet sounds like privileged. I'm talking about internet because they're deep enough to not have cellular. So without internet, you don't get alerts. So it's for that reason. But they don't have beds. Like, they're not places where you could comfortably or even safely shelter long term. You go in and then you wait for the all clear, if you can get it on your phone, and then you go out. But like, they're often smelly. They're just kind of gross. And my contention has been, we knew this war was coming for 40, 50 years, certainly since last summer. Between now and then, or more ideally a few years ago, why didn't the city say, for every block, instead of having these sort of ugly shelters or very dilapidated shelters that don't actually provide the protection that we'd wish for, let's build one big one that does. You can sleep in it. It mightn't be the Ritz, but it's going to be, respectable. And more importantly, it's going to have that 3 meter of solid concrete wall that is required for a blast. We've talked about before how different countries do it, Switzerland and other places around the world. And I guess my devil's advocate question is, budgetarily speaking, how expensive would that be? That it's something that Israel hasn't done. And what do you think of the future debate? I mean, I guess we're kind of hanging in the air a bit, because we hope that this will be the final war with Iran. We hope that this is the last time that we'll deal with an active ballistic missile threat. But if it isn't, then the question of how should we continue with this program is very, very much non-academic and actually relevant to that. So Herman and Corn, I leave it here over to you two.
Herman, I saw you staring at a structural engineering diagram this morning with the same intensity most people reserve for a wedding photo. I assume it had something to do with why our walls aren't thick enough to stop a heavy impact.
It was a cross-section of a 3-meter reinforced concrete slab, corn. It is beautiful in its own way, but it is also terrifying when you realize how far away we are from that being a standard. Today's prompt from Daniel is about that disparity. He is looking at the recent reports questioning the safety of our current safe rooms, specifically the fact that surviving a direct hit from a 500-kilogram ballistic missile would require concrete walls 3 meters thick.
3 meters. That is nearly 10 feet of solid concrete. My living room isn't even 10 feet wide. If I put a 3-meter wall in my apartment, I would be living in a very expensive, very gray hallway.
Herman Poppleberry here, and you have identified the architectural impossibility of this. Daniel is asking why we haven't shifted to larger, high-spec shared shelters given the density of our cities and the state of existing infrastructure. He wants to know the budgetary impact and the future of these programs if the missile threat keeps escalating like it has this March.
It is a fair question. We are in late March 2026, and after the hits we saw in Petah Tikva and Ramat Gan earlier this month, the confidence in the standard safe room is wearing off. People followed the instructions, they got into their marmots, and yet we still saw fatalities because a heavy warhead doesn't care about 20 centimeters of reinforced concrete. It treats it like a minor obstacle rather than a barrier.
The physics are brutal. When you have a half-ton warhead traveling at several times the speed of sound, the kinetic energy alone is staggering. We are talking about energy densities that can liquefy standard construction materials. Current safe rooms, or mamads as they are known in Israel, are designed for 20 to 30 centimeters of concrete. That is meant to protect you from blast overpressure and shrapnel from a near miss. It was never intended to be a shield against a direct hit from a precision-guided ballistic missile.
So we have been building for one type of threat, and now the reality is much heavier. If the experts, like Dr. Benny Brosh, are saying we need a 10-fold increase in concrete thickness, why are we still sticking with the residential model? Is it just a matter of momentum, or is there a deeper engineering reason why the shared deep shelter hasn't become the gold standard?
It is a combination of three things: the last mile problem, the physics of excavation, and the sheer economic weight of the project. The last mile problem is the most human element. In high-density urban zones, your warning time might be 90 seconds. If you are on the 12th floor of an apartment building, you cannot get to a deep shared neighborhood shelter in 90 seconds.
Especially not if you are elderly or have a toddler like Ezra. You would spend 60 of those 90 seconds just waiting for an elevator that you aren't even supposed to use during an emergency. The residential safe room exists because it is the only thing you can actually reach before the impact. It is a compromise between perfect safety and actual accessibility. We have historically relied on basement-level safe rooms, but the math has changed.
It has changed because the threat has evolved. We used to focus on statistical survival, the idea that if you are in a reinforced room, your odds go up by 80% because most hits are near misses. But as Daniel points out, the direct hit is becoming the new normal. To understand why, we have to look at the engineering of a 3-meter wall. To stop a 500-kilogram warhead traveling at Mach 3, you aren't just stopping a piece of metal, you are absorbing a massive kinetic energy dump.
Right. It is not just about the missile poking a hole in the wall. It is about the shockwave.
There are two main failure points when a missile hits concrete: scabbing and spalling. Scabbing is when the impact side, the outside, is crushed. Spalling is the real killer. That is when the shockwave travels through the concrete and causes the inside face of the wall to explode inward. Even if the missile doesn't break through, the people inside are hit by high-velocity concrete fragments. To prevent spalling from a half-ton warhead, you need that 3-meter thickness to dissipate the wave before it reaches the interior surface.
So, if we can't put 3 meters of concrete on the 10th floor of an apartment building because the building would collapse under the weight, why aren't we digging down? Why isn't every city block sitting on top of a massive hardened bunker?
That brings us to the engineering impossibility of retrofitting high-density cities. Imagine trying to dig a deep shelter in downtown Tel Aviv or New York. You aren't just digging through dirt. You are navigating a labyrinth of fiber optic cables, high-voltage power lines, water mains, and the foundations of skyscrapers that are already under immense pressure. To build a shelter that can hold 1,000 people with 3 meters of overhead cover, you would need to excavate a space the size of a small cathedral.
And you'd have to do it without the buildings above it falling into the hole.
The structural shoring required for that kind of urban excavation would cost more than the buildings themselves. And then there is the material science limitation. Traditional reinforced concrete has a limit to its shear strength. To get to 3-meter levels of protection, you often need specialized high-performance concrete or composite layering with steel plates. We are talking about a massive increase in the global demand for cement and specialized alloys.
It sounds like we are stuck between a thin wall and a hole we can't afford to dig. Let's talk about that cost. Daniel asked about the budgetary impact. If a government decided every citizen gets a spot in a deep earth shelter, what are we actually looking at?
The numbers are frankly terrifying. Earlier this month, the Israeli government approved an emergency plan for about 81 million shekels to deploy 1,100 portable shelters. That sounds like a lot of money, but it is only about $20,000 per unit. Those are basically concrete boxes you drop in a parking lot. They are better than nothing, but they are not the 3-meter thick bunkers Daniel is asking about.
$20,000 for a maybe versus how much for a definitely?
A deep earth shared shelter for 1,000 people, built to survive a direct hit with 3 meters of overhead cover and specialized ventilation. You are looking at tens of millions of dollars for a single site. If you try to scale that to a population of 10 million, you are talking about hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. For context, that is several times the annual defense budget of most mid-sized nations.
So, it is a choice between building the shelters and having a functioning economy.
It is a cold calculation, and it leads to the missile city fallacy. We see this with deep underground military bases built 500 meters deep into solid rock. Those are incredibly safe, but they are strategic assets for military places to hide missiles and command centers. You can't replicate that for a civilian population.
Why not? If a military can do it, why can't a modern city?
Because of the deep tomb problem. A military base has a controlled population, specialized life support, and people who are trained to live in a hole for months. A civilian shelter needs to accommodate children, the elderly, and people with medical needs. You need massive amounts of oxygen, waste management, and multiple redundant exits that won't be buried by the rubble of the city above. If a 5-story building collapses on top of your deep shelter's only exit, that shelter just became a very expensive tomb.
That is a grim image. So, if the deep shelters are too expensive and the residential safe rooms are too thin, where does that leave us? Daniel asked about the future of these programs. Are we just giving up on passive defense?
We aren't giving up, but we are shifting the paradigm. We are moving from the physics of the blast to the economics of the interception. Think of it like a helmet versus a bullet. Instead of building a thicker helmet, you try to stop the bullet before it hits the head.
That makes sense. You focus on the interception rather than the impact.
The budgetary priority is shifting toward AI-integrated layered interception. If you spend $1 million on a high-tech interceptor like David's Sling or the Iron Dome, and it successfully stops a 500-kilogram warhead 20 kilometers in the air, you have protected an entire city block. That same $1 million would only buy you a few meters of deep earth tunneling.
But that feels like a very high-stakes game of hoping the software doesn't glitch. If I am a resident in the city, I would much rather have 3 meters of concrete over my head than a promise that a computer in a trailer somewhere is going to intercept a supersonic missile.
I understand that instinct, but look at the math of survival. In the recent exchanges we have seen this month, interception rates were hovering above 90% for some of the most advanced threats. The goal of the modern state is to make the direct hits so rare that you don't need 3-meter walls. You only need the 20-centimeter walls to protect you from the debris of the interception.
So the safe room isn't there to stop the missile. It is there to stop the pieces of the missile that the Iron Dome already broke.
That is the shift. It is a move from survive the hit to prevent the hit. And this is where the future of civil defense is going, distributed sensor networks. Instead of building massive bunkers, governments are investing in tech that can give you a more precise warning. If we can't make the room stronger, we can make the warning better.
What does that look like in practice?
It looks like precision protection. Imagine a system where, instead of a citywide siren, your phone pings and tells you that a missile is projected to hit your specific coordinates in 60 seconds, and you need to move exactly 200 meters north to a hardened zone. It is cheaper to move a person than it is to move 10,000 tons of concrete.
That sounds like a very stressful ping, Herman. Move 3 blocks left in the next 40 seconds or you're toast.
It is futuristic and stressful, but it is the only way to maintain urban life. If we demanded 3-meter walls for every home, we would have to stop building homes. The weight alone would cause most buildings to collapse under their own structural requirements. To support a 3-meter concrete ceiling on the 10th floor, the columns on the first floor would have to be massive. You would lose half your floor space just to the structural supports. You would end up with brutalist pyramids where nobody can actually live.
I see the point. You'd have a city of fortresses where no one has a kitchen because the walls are too thick.
There is a physical limit to what residential architecture can bear. The takeaway for Daniel and our listeners is that your safe room is a shield against the chaos of war, but it is not a fortress against a dedicated precision strike. It is a reality check.
So, what should people actually look for in their local municipal planning? If we aren't getting deep shelters, what are we getting?
Look for active resilience. Is your city investing in better sensor networks? Are they mandating hardened zones in new construction? We are seeing a move toward mandating 40 or 50 centimeters of concrete in new builds, an upgrade, but still not the 3-meter standard. Poland is currently trying something ambitious with a 16 billion zloty fund that is about 3.8 billion euros to mandate bomb shelters in all new residential buildings starting this year.
16 billion zloty sounds like a serious commitment, but is that for deep shelters or just better basements?
It is mostly for hardened basements. It is an upgrade, but it still doesn't hit that 3-meter requirement for heavy ballistic threats. The reality is that no government on Earth is currently prepared to spend the trillions of dollars required to provide 3-meter thick shielding for every citizen. It is an engineering and fiscal impossibility.
It is the difference between a fortress and a home. Most people would rather live in a home with a decent safe room and a very good missile defense system than in a 3-meter thick concrete box that they can't afford to leave.
That frames it perfectly. The Golden Dome isn't just a military project, it is an urban planning project. It is the only thing that allows modern high-density cities to continue existing in a world of precision ballistic threats. Without it, the 3-meter wall requirement would eventually force us to abandon urban centers entirely.
Which would be a win for the guys firing the missiles. If they can make our cities unlivable just by existing, they don't even need to fire. So, staying above ground, keeping the walls at a reasonable thickness, and investing in the high-tech shield is actually a form of strategic defiance.
It really is. For those who want to dive deeper into the specific engineering trade-offs, the sheer strength of concrete and the structural connections are the key factors. Thick doesn't always mean safe if the connections are weak.
And the concept of missile cities really puts the civilian part of civil defense into perspective.
One last thing on the future of the program. Keep an eye on the Golden Dome developments in the United States and Israel. The Strategic Missile Defense Working Group just had a big session on this on March 13th. They are looking at AI-integrated mobile systems that can be deployed to protect specific high-value urban blocks. It is the end of the static bunker era and the beginning of the mobile shield era.
A mobile shield sounds much more my speed. I can stay in my apartment, keep my living room wider than a hallway, and let the robots do the heavy lifting in the stratosphere.
That is the dream. Whether the budget holds up against the sheer volume of missiles being produced is the next big question, but that is a topic for another day.
I think we have given Daniel plenty to chew on. It is a sobering look at the math of survival, but it is better to know the limits of your walls than to find them out the hard way.
Knowledge of the gap is the first step toward closing it, or at least finding a way to work around it.
Well, if you will excuse me, I am going to go measure my walls, and then probably just buy a really thick helmet. Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the show running smoothly while we contemplate the weight of concrete.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. It is the tech behind the scenes that makes these deep dives possible.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you're enjoying our brotherly dives into the weird and the technical, a quick review on your podcast app helps us more than you know.
Find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe.
Catch you on the next one.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and fall.